Hello, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. This weekend, don't forget, or this week, you are on your new hybrid schedule. So you are either going to cohort A live classes or cohort B live classes. Please make sure you have your note taker out and that you are defining the key terms and answering the big question for credit on this assignment. Okay, remember today as you are listening, our big question that you are trying to answer is, what events during the 1850s further divided the nation on the issue of slavery? Okay, so keeping that in your mind as we go through this presentation. There we go. All right. So really we're talking about the events that led up to the Civil War. So first we need to understand the Compromise of 1850. To please the North, Californians enter as a free state, which ended they ended slave trade in Washington, D.C. Sorry, guys. To please the South, they made a strict fugitive slave law, which meant that if a slave went to one of the northern states, they had to return them to the South and couldn't intervene. Settled border problems between New Mexico and Texas, area for Mexican secession divided into Utah and New Mexico, slavery issue to be decided by popular sovereignty. Again, problems better for a short period of time and then became worse. So newly gained territory, California, requested to be included in the Union as a free state. Well, this would upset the balance of power and violate the conditions of the Missouri Compromise. Okay, so the Compromise of 1850 was struck. It included 5 provisions, including the fugitive slave law. In return for allowing California to be admitted as a free state, citizens in a free territory were now responsible for helping to capture and return escaped slaves. Obviously, the abolitionists were having none of this. They did not like this at all. So the abolitionists were appalled at the idea of being complicit in slavery. Abolitionist sentiment continued to grow in the North, particularly upon the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. All right, so here again, we take a look at what is happening with the map in the United States. Okay, notice closely the Missouri Compromise line and what is starting to happen as we move west and start to claim the territory. Okay, so you can see that the green is free states and territories. The orange is slave states, and then purple is open to slavery by popular sovereignty, which is the Compromise of 1850. All right, so we have the Fugitive Slave Law. So this law was part of the Compromise of 1850. It was a law that required citizens to catch runaway slaves. If a person did not comply, they could be fined up to $1,000 or put into jail for 6 months. Judges received $10 if they returned a slave and $5 if they freed them. Many Blacks who were free were captured and sent back into slavery. Northerners hated this law because it forced them to become a part of the system of slavery, which was something that they were fighting so hard to get rid of. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, as was mentioned just a minute ago. So this was a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was written to show the evils of slavery by telling the story of an older slave who was whipped to death by his owner. More than 2 million copies sold within a decade. After reading it, many Northerners began to change their view of slavery. Southerners said the book was full of lies. Obviously, it was incredibly controversial because of the debate that was currently going on in the United States. All right, so we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, okay? So in 1854, an attempt was made to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, which was in free territory. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed to settle the issue created by the Missouri Compromise. Now, new states would decide to be free or slave territory through popular votes. Pro-slavery and abolitionist forces alike poured into the area with the intent of voting on the issue. The result was bloodshed. So what does this act do? It divides land into Kansas and Nebraska territories, decided that slavery issue would be decided by popular sovereignty. What does that mean? Essentially voting, okay? So pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in one area, and this leads to conflict, obviously. Northerners believe this repeals the Missouri Compromise, leads to bleeding in Kansas. Okay, so on the Kansas-Missouri border, both sides clashed in what would be known as bleeding Kansas. Throughout the 1850s, there were several skirmishes and murders. Approximately between 56 to 200 people were killed. Supporting the Free State cause was a new political party, the Republican Party. Republicans formed from the Free Soil Party, whose goal was to prevent slavery from expanding west. Abraham Lincoln became an important leader in the Republican Party. They were opposed by the pro-slavery Southern Democrats, which is actually very interesting because that does not necessarily match what we're seeing in our current Democrats and Republicans. So anti-slavery and pro-slavery, sorry, my picture's in the way, groups rushed supporters to Kansas since popular vote would decide the slavery issue. Pro-slavery voters crossed the border to vote, allowing their side to win the vote. The new government created strict laws, including that those who held fugitive slaves could be put to death. Anti-slavery groups were created, a new government in protest. Controversy over slavery affected everyone in Kansas. So bleeding Kansas is kind of what I was already talking about. Sack of Lawrence. Pro-slavery grand jury charged anti-slavery government with treason. Pro-slavery forces attacked city of Lawrence, the location of anti-slavery leaders. Kansas collapsed into a civil war. Congress. So Senator Charles Sumner criticized pro-slavery people and insulted Senator Pickens Butler. Representative Preston Brooks beat Sumner unconscious. So it's important to understand this is a really big deal, a life or death type of decision. Here's a political cartoon, I suppose, of what's happening. So the Pottawatomie Creek killings, 1856. Because of the violence going on in Kansas, John Brown and 4 of his sons decided to take the law into their own hands. They ride into a small town named Pottawatomie Creek, pull 5 pro-slavery men out of their beds in the middle of the night. The men are murdered. John Brown believes he is doing what God has told him to do. Many Northerners, while they don't believe in slavery, are appalled at what they did. So John Brown was an abolitionist preacher who believed that violence was the only answer to end slavery. He believed slavery was a sin and that he was on a mission from God to end it. In Kansas, Brown and his sons killed 5 pro-slavery supporters. So we'll get to that in a second. In 1858, Brown planned a raid on a federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to steal the armaments, arm slaves, and lead a slave army through the South. The raid failed. There was no slave revolt, and Brown was captured by federal forces. Brown was tried and executed for his crimes. His death, however, only further lit the match of war. Abolitionists believed he was a martyred hero. So Jayhawks and MU Tigers, where do you think the rivalry comes from? So now you can kind of, this really goes back to this pre-Civil War time. And the border wars that we're talking about here, right? Pro-slavery, anti-slavery is really what we're talking about. So basically that is the start of that. All right, so we have Dred Scott versus Sanford. So Dred Scott was a slave. He had lived in free territory with his owner, believing he had earned his freedom. His owner moved back into Missouri, a slave state. While there, the owner died. Scott had abolitionist attorneys file a lawsuit for him, claiming his freedom. It went to the Supreme Court, but he lost. So Scott went ahead and sued the government. In 1857, amidst all the turmoil, the court declared that Scott, as an African-American, wasn't even a person under the Constitution. Therefore, he couldn't bring a lawsuit to the court. Further, the court declared that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, claiming that the government could not prevent slavery in any of the states. Abolitionists were enraged. The Dred Scott decision stood until it was reversed by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution after the Civil War. When the Constitution was, this is what Chief Justice Roger said about this case. When the Constitution was adopted, African Americans were not regarded in any of the states as members of the community, which constituted the state, and were not numbered among its people or citizen. Consequently, the special rights and immunities guaranteed to citizens do not apply to them. And not being citizens within the meaning of the Constitution, they are not entitled to sue in that character in a court of the United States. Can you even imagine? So the worst Supreme Court decision in history. It ruled that African Americans, whether free or slave, were not citizens and had no right to sue in federal court. If you're starting to get appalled, you should be. You're starting to get angry, you should be. Also ruled Missouri Compromise restriction on slavery was unconstitutional and slavery could be allowed anywhere. Most white Southerners cheered the decision. The ruling stunned many Northerners, including Illinois lawyer Abraham Lincoln, who warned about its consequences. The ruling wouldn't be reversed until after the Civil War, when the 13th and 14th Amendments were added to the Constitution. So political parties undergo change. Some Whigs, Democrats, Free Soilers, and abolitionists joined in 1854 to reform the Republican Party. They are united against the spread of slavery to the West. That is like their main goal. Democrats were in trouble. Those who supported the Kansas-Nebraska debate were not reelected. Southerners feared a Republican candidate could become president. Why don't they want that? Remember, Republicans at this time are anti-slavery and Democrats of the South are pro-slavery. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Illinois Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln for the US Senate in 1858. His opponent was Democrat Stephen Douglas, who had been senator since 1847. Lincoln challenged Douglas to what became the historic Lincoln-Douglas debates. So what was their argument over? Slavery mostly. Lincoln stressed that the central issue of campaign was spread of slavery in the West. Douglas criticized Lincoln for saying nation could not remain half slave and half free. And we know, because this is history, that Lincoln was right. Douglas put forth Freeport Doctrine. People had right to introduce or exclude slavery. Douglas won, but Lincoln became an important Republican Party leader and later becomes the president. So we have the raid on Harper's Ferry, which I already mentioned a minute ago with John Brown. So John Brown was at it again. This time he led 18 people, including 5 African Americans, into Harper's Ferry. They planned to raid an arsenal and start a slave revolt. No problem. Oh, the problem? No slaves rose to help. A number of his men died and Brown was arrested by Robert E. Lee. Brown was tried and found guilty of murder and treason. He was later hanged. So Brown, Frederick Douglass said, "His zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light. Mine was bounded by time, his stretched away to the boundless shores of eternity. I could live for the slave, but he could die for them." So this really sets the stage for war. Many Northerners mourned his death, but criticized his methods. Most Southern whites felt threatened and newspapers started to call for leaving the Union in order to remain safe. And that ends our presentation today. I hope you learned a lot. Make sure that you complete your note taker and have a fantastic day.